Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome. We all gather here today, whether it's us on stage here or you people in the audience there, as people who love novels. And I think one of the things that we love most about novels is if we made a little poll for each one of us of what our favorite 5 or 6 novels were, there would hardly be anything in common. The world of novels is big enough that it can accommodate all our histories, all our preferences, all our loves in reading. And it's partly to exchange these stories and work out what is meaningful about our own novel reading pasts that we come here today with people from so many continents and so many novelistic styles. It says in our festival brochure that the novel began with some experiments in literary form in 18th century England. I think this is something that the British or English cannot take credit for. It has to be taken away from them. What about Cervantes? What about Diderot? What about all these other people?
Murasaki. Lady Murasaki.
Yes, Lady Murasaki in 11th century Japan with Tale of Genji. It seems to me that the reason why the novel not only came up but has survived and now has become the form of first choice for writers around the world. One reason for that is that it's a kind of mongrel form. It's almost inexhaustible in how it can be adapted, and so whoever wants to write a story can sort of adapt it to their own purposes. Something else about it is that for the first time, and this is why the novels became popular, is that it tells the story of everyday characters and shows how there's something remarkable in each human being, rather than always saying the stories of kings and queens and people who are powerful. And the last reason why I think we go to novels is that they tell stories against the grain, that they are places where you can find laughter, subversion, stories that have not been told. So to discuss all of this and how in our own time where novels are going and what is being done with them as we speak by writers around the world, I have these 4 wonderful people. But I'm going to begin with you, Charmaine, because aside from writing novels, I want to you to speak first, your first career, or you began as an actor before you came to novels. And I think one of the very good things about novels is that it's enriched by the fact that people bring their different life experiences. Not everybody starts off as a writer. And what were you able to bring, for instance, to the writing of dialogue in novels from what you learned about emoting as an actor? For instance, about the theory of motivations. When, novels ask us to read more carefully. When somebody says something in a novel, there's registers and layers beneath that, and the same in acting. So how are you able to put those things together?
I think the easiest way to answer that is I was a high school student, actually, in I grew up in the United States, but I was at an acting program at the British American Drama Academy in Oxford for one summer, studying Chekhov, and at one point, my teacher there, a man named Earl Gister, who was faculty at Yale Drama School, came up to me and he whispered in my ear, "You're doing this wrong. You're playing Chekhov as if his lines mean what the character really feels." And he said, "Just try an experiment here. Play it the exact opposite of what the line is. So if the line is, I detest you, the emotion behind it is something else, such as, I love you and I detest the fact that you're hurting me." And that was sort of like a switch flipped, at the moment for my acting, where it really was a lesson in mixed motivations, in subtext, in opposition, in the way that, for me, I mean, one of the pleasures of reading fiction is inhabiting a consciousness and so experiencing the way that any of us can have all these levels of perception that are often in contention with one another at the same moment. So maybe.
It's interesting you say that, because it's always seemed to me that the novel is the greatest technology that has ever been invented by man to record the nature of human thought. That you can record brain waves in neuroscience, but that's not the same as tracing how thought shifts from relevant to irrelevant. In fact, when you see thought being performed in novels, you see that people don't stay on subject as they do sometimes when they speak. And Linda, the other thing that you can do in novels is, of course, novels don't just have to be the present. They are separate from history, a way back into not just the facts of the past, but the subjective experience of the past, and that's what you try to do in the purchase. Try to tell us why this is more interesting to you than writing something about people living around you today.
Is it more interesting? I guess it is more interesting to me because I've always wanted, if I could be a time traveler, I'd be a time traveler. And I don't think I'd ever go into the future. I think I'd always go into the past. I mean, I just spent so much of my childhood trying to imagine what it was like where I grew up in Kansas before white people came there. I was fascinated by that. They didn't have any telephone poles. They didn't have any, so the landscape would have looked different. The tall grass hadn't been eaten by anything but a buffalo. So anyway, I was quite consumed with that passion. And I'm not a futurist at all, I'm afraid. And the other thing, all this is the thought process is that when we're all sitting at a table and we're having a conversation, as we are doing here, we all are having some much more interesting thoughts in our heads than what we're saying to you. We may be, who knows? But that's what I always want to capture on the page, is what's really going on in the human mind and not what's just on the surface. So that's what's fun about novels.
When I think about my own life with novels, I remember that I read novels for many years before I learned to love them. And then I loved them for many years before I learned how to write them. And so it's clear that they're different, although they all seem one straight line now, when we look back into the past, for instance, you, Abubakar, was there a moment for you where you decided that you didn't just want to be a reader of novels, you wanted to write them? Is there some writer, some moment or a page or a story that makes you make that jump in your head?
Yeah, actually I think there is. I grew up writing before I even knew what I was doing. So the decision to become a writer was already made for me by whatever force was behind all of that inspiration. But the one moment I do remember that kind of convinced me that this is what I really want to do was at the age of 13 when I read this book, The Prisoner of Zenda.
Yes.
Yeah. And I loved the way his expressions flowed, and I loved the story. And I said, I want to write like that. And for me, that was how, this consciousness came that I want to write. I mean, prior to that, I kind of knew I was a storyteller, because before I could even write, I was drawing pictures that told stories. And then reading that book just transformed me. So I knew that, yes, there's a preferred artistic form of expression for me, and it is writing. And that was how I took off. Yeah.
Chika, you have said that what are the connections in novel writing? There is, on the one hand, it seems like writing novels requires an immense amount of stamina. That is actually everyday labor of a particular kind that, for instance, the mythology of poetry is completely different. That's something to do with inspiration and a sudden glimpse. But isn't there a space in novels that combines the two? Can one combine madness and everydayness in the space of the novel?
I think your question is twofold, and I'm trying to think of how to answer it. So I'm going to go back to Igbo cosmology. So I'm Igbo from Southeast Nigeria. And in Igbo cosmology, it is the same goddess of creativity that also gives madness. So with the one hand, she gives you creativity, and with the other hand, she gives you madness. And so you can't really separate the two. And for a very long time, I wasn't scared that I was going to go mad. But I've always been very fascinated by the idea of writers also tending to be depressed, and also writers tending to be mad. And I think you need a certain level of insanity to be able to create to be able to write, because you're basically creating a world in your head. And the sort of people who create worlds in their heads are people who are mad, right? And it was only in Igbo cosmology that I sort of found that containment of both madness and what you would call everydayness in one.
Charmaine, I think you are the only one amongst us who not only writes fiction but also teaches it. And I imagine these are two completely different skills, that one learns to see beautiful things and interesting things in novels, and then one is very puzzled when other readers don't seem to do so. And how do you make that bridge to welcome others into, because I imagine when students come to you, they already are in your course because they know they love novels, but they can't exactly explain why. So how do you bring novels down from the art of the story, down into the art of the sentence, the paragraph, the word, and little shifts of register?
Yeah, there's an interesting correlation in a way between the distinction of fiction as a narrative form, that being it's really its preoccupation with consciousness and its ability to draw us into a mind, and my teaching style, which aims to make conscious for students for whom perhaps writing isn't necessarily intuitive. Writing a dramatic scene, inhabiting a consciousness isn't necessarily intuitive. So there's a relationship between the distinction of fiction and my desire to make conscious for them how narrative effects are produced. And I have found that simply by really slowing down, which really the novel is a slow engagement, right? And so by slowing down in the classroom and focusing on consciousness, on, for example, the relationship between narrative choices and narrative effects, between syntactical choices and narrative effects, how, for example, a paragraph that's a single sentence propels us forward, encourages us to sit at the edge of our seats, and yet is utterly clear through punctuation, through repetition of refrains, or whatever. Or how fantastic writers avoid redundancy, and encourage suspense through paradox, through opposition. All of that has really, I think, helped my students not only understand their own emotional responses, even physiological responses to a piece of writing, why their heartbeat suddenly increases or something while they're reading a piece of fiction, but has also kind of emulated the process for them that we all practice when we're writing a piece of work, which is, on the one hand, has an effect of spontaneity and yet has been, as you were saying, a labor, a series of choices. There are moments where things arrive, but then there are so many other moments where we're having to make endless choices in order to produce effects.
Linda, in writing novels about the past, I want you to tell the audience something about, I imagine there's two levels of things. One, because novels are full of details of materiality, of what characters wear, where they walk, what kind of trees they walk under, what kind of houses and rooms they live in. These are things you have to dredge out from either from the imagination or by research or from a mix of the two. But what about the question of language itself? When you think about how could one go wrong by actually trying to reproduce the speech rhythms of another time? Because why should everything be so perfectly literal?
I think one could go very wrong trying to do that. I mean, if we look at a certain period, let's say 1850 in America, and the way people spoke and the way people wrote, if I did that, it would be ludicrous, right? I mean, so my task then is to find a voice, and in my most recent book, I sort of have several points of view. So they also have to be a little varied. One character is a 13-year-old boy, his mother, his father, a slave, etc. They each have to kind of be believable in their thought patterns, but also modern enough. I don't know. It's a tricky business, but it's a lot of fun to try and find a way to impart their minds working. And we don't always think in words, and so that's another issue. And plus, one of my characters is a bear, which gets a little nonverbal.
Chika, I know that you, one of the reasons why you write novels is that, and this is why it's exciting always for each generation to be novelists, is there are stories happening in our world today that have not been told. And so It's for someone to grab that space and bring these things out into the open. And this is something that led you to write your books. Will you tell us something about that?
One of the reasons why I write is because, you know, I can't imagine not writing. And when you asked Abubakar what propelled him to write, one of my earliest influences was Flora Nwapa, who, you know, Nigerian, the first African woman to be published in the West in 1962. This was 4 years after Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart came out, and she was discovered by Achebe. Achebe was her editor. And Flora Nwapa's daughter was my classmate. And Flora would come to our school with books that she'd written, or books from her publishing house. She also wrote children's books. And Flora was like, I really wanted to be like her. So I think if I trace my wanting to write novels to anything, it is first of all to Flora Nwapa. And I think that it's not as much new stories as new ways of telling those stories, because I think that everything's been told, and we just sort of find ways to retell them. But one of the stories I'm very interested in, I'm very interested in stories of people at the margins. I find their stories very fascinating. So people who don't have a chance to be part of the center. So my first novel, which is only out in Belgium and in Nigeria, is about a Nigerian immigrant woman who lives in a small city in Turnhout, and sort of how a small city in Belgium called Turnhout, and how she sort of like navigates that space, you know, being an outsider in this place where she's not, you know, quite fully welcome, and dealing with the anxieties of being an immigrant somewhere where she, you know, does not speak the language. And so I moved to Belgium many years ago when I got married, and one of the anxieties I had to deal with was the thought of somebody back home dying. So every time the phone rang, I was scared to pick up the phone because I thought it might be news that someone had died. And the second novel, On Black Sister Street, is about Nigerian sex workers in Antwerp. So again, you know, people at the margins, so they've lived in Antwerp for so many years, but many of them don't speak the language. They sort of inhabit a particular space. And I also discovered that when we tell narratives of immigrants, the narrative of immigrant sex workers, especially African sex workers, does not get told. And when it does get told, it's always a narrative of victimhood. Yes. And so when I wrote On Black Sister Street, it was very important for me to capture not just the voices of the characters, but also the feelings. I wanted to know what it felt like to be a Nigerian woman in that space. And so I went to the red light district, so that when I started writing about my characters, you know, doing the red light district for the first time, I had a fairly good idea of what it would be like to be there as a woman, because when I was there, people who saw me did not think I was a writer. So I could have been one of the girls, one of the women. Yeah. So to answer your question, I sort of feel like I've gone on.
It does, but I was thinking of another question while you were speaking. You said yesterday when we were in conversation at another session that you found out that for these women, after observing them, you thought shame is a kind of luxury that somebody like us would feel in that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the questions that one of the women, of the questions.
If I may interrupt you, I don't actually want to explore.
No, just a short.
Yeah. But when one realizes this, is that the sort of thing that one also says in the book, or does one leave the reader to find that out?
I mean, I think I leave the reader to find out, and if the reader wants to judge the women, it's the reader's own business. I don't interfere. I mean, I think I'm just a medium, so I tell the story, and the reader, you know, can take whatever they want to take from the work. I just think that, for me, it's very important to have integrity as a writer, and for that integrity to be upheld, I had to tell the stories as truthfully, as emotionally truthfully as I could. Yeah.
Just to add, I think the novel is exactly the place to get past first impressions, second impressions, third impressions.
Yeah.
It's also a good place to think about context. When I'm writing about America in the 1800s, and I'm writing about slavery. I'm writing about both slave owners and slaves, but I cannot do that from the context that I live in, which would look at everything very differently. I don't think that's my job as a storyteller. I think that the interesting thing about novels is that you implant yourself in a context that is utterly different, whether it's gender, race, or whatever. That's the thrill of it, and it's also the thrill for the reader.
Yeah, I found it interesting when Chika was talking about being inspired by Flora Nwapa. And, to have a living role model was a luxury I never had. So for me, when I started off writing, I sort of thought, well, like I mentioned, I read Anthony Hope and The Prisoner of Zenda. And Anthony Hope had been dead for a very long time before I read him, right? So I had this idea that novelists were essentially dead people. And
novelists essentially dead people.
Yeah, and you just sit down in your room, lock yourself in, and write. And then when you finish, you die, right? And
like
you have, sort of like a mosquito. And you have a pile of manuscripts right beside your cups, and someone comes and discovers these manuscripts and publish them. And then you become a novelist.
Oh my God.
So that was that was how I came to writing. So I started off that way. And for me, it was beneficial because I wrote without pressure. I wrote without the expectation of being published at that time. So I just wrote, principally, just like that. And that was...
Which is the best way to write, really. It's, no pressure. And when I was writing on Black Sister Street, I was very concerned about my parents. My parents reading this book, and about having to tell them that I did research in the red light districts, because my parents are very Catholic. And I had to pretend that they would never read the book, and that they would never hear about it. And so that was the only way I could write what I wanted to write. And then when it came out, I did some tours, and I did lots of interviews, and I did one on the BBC. And my father listens to the BBC a lot, and he was visiting me when that interview was sent out. And I was trying to bring him out of the room. I didn't want him to hear it. I was like, but no, I want to listen to the BBC. And suddenly it was, I was on the radio talking about doing research, and I was mortified. I thought he was going to come out and, judge me. But he was fine. He was fine with it.
Okay, that's good, because I have a similar experience. So my novel is about a grandmother who was having a very explicit relationship with someone who is 30 years younger.
Yes.
In a very conservative Muslim community. And it's this is a community that hasn't been written about in English for a very long time. So this was sort of like an opening for a lot of people. And this is a very conservative community, right? So I wrote this novel, and I asked myself, why am I writing about sex and people having sex? And those are people from this particular background. And I said, well, it's a story, and this is a story I wanted to tell. So I remained faithful to the story, to the characters, and I shut out all outside influences. And my wife read the manuscript, and she was horrified. And she was like, there's this expression in Hausa, which was like, which is sort of like, it is not in your place to write something like this. And I said, well, this is the story, and this is how it's going to be, and that's just it. So I kind of relate with what Chika is saying about having to do with this kind of pressure. Of course, I was worried about what my mother was going to think, but as a writer, my principal loyalty is to my art and to my characters, and I just felt, okay, I'm okay with that. Fortunately, by the time a lot of my family members, relatives, and all that had read the book, it had won this very big prize, right? So there was this big money attached to it. Yeah, and they read it, and they were like, oh, okay, that's good. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's good, because of the price, yeah.
There's another thing that happens, though. I was working on a book of nonfiction at the time that my mother was actually sort of losing it. And she came into the story off and on throughout anyway, because it was a very personal book. It had a lot to do with me and my background, my upbringing. Meanwhile, my mother's going slightly mad, becoming quite demented. And I wanted you know, I was so involved with that, and it meant so much to me, but I also felt I was betraying her. And what would her friends think? That I had, portrayed an episode in which she looks quite ridiculous or something. So, I mean, it wasn't that I thought she'd ever read it, but I felt that I was betraying. And now sometimes I feel I've betrayed my ancestors who were the slave owners, because I've said things about them that undoubtedly are not quite factual, particularly sexually. So there you are.
Well, as Hanif Qureshi once said, when a writer is born, a family dies. Continuing on the theme of death for a little bit, Abubakar, you said you thought novelists are essentially dead people, and then you found out that's not so. But of course, in another sense, they are so. As are human beings. Most human beings are essentially dead when you look back at the past, and most novelists that we read are people from another time. And Charmaine, I wanted to ask you, is it important as a reader of novels to read novels from not just from other parts of the world, but from other centuries? And in doing so, does one sometimes find that one has this idea that technique always progresses, but is it necessarily so that novels from the past have a more rudimentary method? Sometimes you go back, for instance, when you go back to Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern.
Yeah, I was thinking of Tristram Shandy.
Yeah, it's a story told in the first person by this, but he only, although he's telling his own story, he only gets born in chapter 4.
Right. Yeah, talk about innovative. I mean, I really reject this whole idea of the novel is by nature elastic, and as you were saying, it's a mongrel form that kind of shifts according to its subject. And in answer to your first question, is it important? I'm always reading and teaching novelists from the past and the present. I think it was the poet Adam Zajewski that said something like, "My parliament is not in the present or in the future, but in the past and the present." And you know, it's so important, I think, especially now in this age of distraction and this age of you know, the latest news, to keep in mind where we came from, literarily and otherwise, and even to keep in mind questions such as, well, what makes a work classic? Why has it endured and been timeless? Is it because it's, in addition to representing maybe a specific socioeconomic context or moment, that it's more fundamentally reflecting on the immutable human condition? And I also have noticed that in those classic, I'm using that a little bit in quotes, novels that we return to, for me, they often are principally concerned with, you might say they're a moral endeavor to engage the question of, well, not only what it means to be human, but what are we all here for? So I consider many of them, even, I might say, spiritual texts.
If I may just engage you that on that for a moment more, when one doesn't like a novel, you know, we've all been discussing what one does love. When one doesn't like something, is one in a position to call it bad, or does one have to hide behind the idea that, like, we all love different kinds of things? There must be a place, surely, if one loves things, to also say that, you know, for this and this reason, this really is not a good piece of work.
Well, okay, well, let me just start from a teaching perspective.
Yes.
I am forced constantly to read things that I don't really like, that aren't my cup of tea, as are my students, right, when we're reading one another's work. But also, I actually intentionally assign novels that aren't my favorite novels, but that I think might be models for my students. And I find it quite useful, because there's a way that we can nevertheless pay homage to what a particular piece of work wants to be, what its intentions are, what its sort of highest aims are, where it's succeeding in those aims and why. And thus, actually, that's sort of an exercise in what the novel does best, which is ask us to engage with something that we might be resistant to initially. A character who might behave reprehensibly, for example. Or even a style that initially might not be easy for us to enter.
Yeah. There's also the whole question of prizes, because once you start giving out prizes to fiction, there's an implication that somehow or other it's kind of like a soccer match, that there is a winner. You know, I mean, if there's a right and a wrong, there's a way to actually weigh this stuff. And I think maybe the public must feel that, whereas
it makes writers hate each other when they otherwise be willing to be very good friends.
But it also gives us the idea that there is a standard.
Yes.
You know, that you can actually get something right.
Mm.
But I mean, I think that reading is subjective, you know, and find there are things that a novel that we don't personally like might teach us, and it's useful to teach people who are learning to write, to read those books that they might originally be resistant to. But there are also badly written books, I mean, just like there are also badly made movies, and you watch them for whatever reason that you want to watch them. And then when it comes to the issue of prizes, I also think it's important to remember that because reading is subjective, prizes are subjective as well. And I was talking to you this morning about judging the Man Booker International last year. And, we had to read 136 books. Of the 136, there were some I absolutely hated. And even when it got to the long list, even to the short list and down to the winner, there were some that I personally didn't like very much, but the other members of the jury really liked. And our job was to sort of convince each other of why we thought, whoever won, was the rightful winner. And there's really no way to weigh these things objectively, and I think it's an exercise in futility to try to do that. And I think we must be aware that also when we're reading with our own biases as well. And we bring those biases to bear on what we're reading and how we experience the work. I mean, I read a novel a while ago. I'm not going to say the title. Very beautifully written, but the subject was reprehensible, And I found myself asking, can I recommend this work because I taught last year, can I recommend this work to students to read in good faith, knowing that the subject is really, really, distasteful, but the writing was beautiful, and at the end I didn't, which is maybe a feeling on my own part, but I also felt that I'm very aware of my subjectivity, and I don't deny that, and so I didn't put the book on the syllabus because I didn't like what he said, even though I liked the way he said it.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting the way people approach literature, and for me it's always interesting to read books from different periods. And that way you only get to see how literature has evolved over the years, and what have been the standards that define different eras, from naturalism to modernism to postmodernism. And you kind of want to have a sense of where the novel is going to go from there, We're living in a very, very interesting times. And you have distractions that people didn't have before. You had elements that defined how people wrote before, especially speaking about naturalism, for instance, right, where you have to kind of embellish every detail, But now people are not really interested in those stuff. And you see how times have changed and how novels have adapted to the times. And now, considering that we're in the social media age, we're in the age of performance, if you like, where you have to perform everything. You have to perform your life, you have to perform your relationship, you have to perform pregnancy, and perform being angry about things, You have to kind of consider how is the novel going to situate itself in this context. And for me, everything is really public, and you have to compete with social media, with reality TV. And we're just discussing this with someone else who mentioned that Trump is going to kill the novel. He's going to kill the novel because he's so dramatic and so out there that there's no way you can capture a character like that in a novel. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
I wonder if some of you have, I sometimes had the thought that some novelists, we also go to novels to learn how to love life again. That there's novelists who give us a sense of a sense of the beauty of the whole of life in ways that we would not have been able to put together ourselves. But there's another very interesting bit of novels I've always loved looking at, its beginnings. That is a place where, you made a commitment to read something for 300 or 400 pages, but that is where, if it is set up properly, within a page you're into somebody else's world, and if it's not done, I even think there should be a word for novels which are very good, but which don't begin particularly well. You have to give them 20 or 30 pages of failure before something then sparks up. But Abubakar, in your case, I really enjoyed, in Season of Crimson Blossoms, in your very first paragraph, you've given away a lot, and that to me shows a certain kind of confidence that you are not particularly bothered about stringing the reader along. Within 50 or 60 words, a lot of things are set up. And did you want to write, did you take special care to write that sort of concentrated opening?
To be honest, I didn't think of that opening that much. It just came. That was where the story started for me, and that paragraph was just in my head consistently. It was just there. And before I even thought of how the rest of the story is going to play out, that thing just kept coming back. And it became a bit obsessive, so I just said, okay, let me write it down. Because I was waiting for the rest of the story to come, and it didn't. So I said, okay, just write it down. And then I did. The moment I started writing it down, it started flowing. But for me, it's very interesting how a reader comes into contact with your work. And the beginning, like you said, is very important. And I remember this very interesting saying by Steve Almond, who is an American novelist, who said, the basic contract between a reader and a writer is that of telling a convincing lie. Mm-hmm.
Nice, yeah.
So you come to this literature, this is fiction, so my expectation is that I'm going to be told a lie, but I want it to be convincing. So it is up to you as a novelist to deliver on this contract. And how people choose to start novels depends on what they want to achieve with it. With my novel, I was very I don't want to say, I'm kind of obstinate that this story deserves to be told the way it's going to be told, irrespective of what anyone thinks. It's the story of these characters, and this is the way these characters want the stories told. And, I disregarded social media, I disregarded public opinions and whatever, and I said, I'm just writing the story the way I think the characters want it to be told, and that's just how I started off.
I think the contract with the reader is, I'm going to give you a room to go into that nobody else can come into, which is so different from public media, right? This is your totally private space. You get to spend an hour with me today, being in a place that nobody else is, and you're alone, and it's delicious, and it's private. It's private. The novel is a very private thing.
It seems to me that the best novels kind of have instead of trying to spoon feed all their meanings, kind of trust the reader to unpack what is being done across hundreds of pages sometimes. But of course, sometimes it's hard to have that sort of trust, and especially in our time, there's a lot of worry perhaps not among novelists themselves, but among people around them, including publishers, of can we, are there enough readers left in the world? Can we depend on readers, or should we have to give them more? Where do you stand on this debate?
And they have focus groups. I was.
They have focus groups in novels now.
I was offered by my editor to have, I've forgotten what she was called. She's a subjective reader or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she was going to kind of check it for political correctness, because because I have slaves and so forth, and we must not offend.
Where do you think that takes us? Is this a development that is of any use?
I think it takes us into deep shit.
Chika, you wanted to say something?
Yes. I'm trying to remember what it was, so go on. No, I wanted to say something about, it wasn't the offense, but what was it that you talked about just before the offense came on? Yeah, the editor. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to say that one of the best lessons I learned from my editor was assume knowledge. And once she said that, she just sort of freed me from everything. She said, as always, assume knowledge. And what people don't know, they'll find out.
That's a good editor.
They should go out. Yeah, I mean, she's a brilliant editor. And once she said that, she just sort of freed me from trying to explain anything and to just concentrate on the storytelling, you know. And then political correctness, I do think that sometimes there's a tendency for people to be, to use the whole idea of I'm not politically correct to be obnoxious, so they want a license to be obnoxious, you know. And I am very much for not trying to offend people. I don't think it's a bad thing to sort of think of the other person,
yes,
whatever you're doing. So I feel very troubled by this tendency for people to, you know, sort of worry about too much political correctness, because I don't think you can have too much kindness.
Right.
You can't have too much goodness, you know. And I think that when we stop, I just think there's something to be said for wanting a license to be obnoxious. And I think that's sort of the feeling that I get sometimes when I hear people complain about political correctness. We can never have too much political correctness, and that is where I stand on that.
At the same time, I think that you were talking about your wife saying, it's not your place.
Yeah.
And I do think that, in a way, we're making an assertion when we write a novel, this is my place.
Yeah.
It's my so I should say I'm coming at this, getting back to the acting question, I was often told, yeah, you're not quite right to play this role, not quite right to play that role, and it was all about the externals. And there's a way in which, by leaping into another subjectivity when we write fiction, that we are saying, this is my place, and part of that for me is having the freedom to represent things perhaps in a complicated way rather than a reductive way. And I think that the danger of political correctness that asks us to give up that freedom is that we feel silenced. So I think it's complicated.
But I mean, sorry to cut in, but I think that there is something to be said for being aware of power dynamics.
Of
you
course,
know, there are stories that are not
yes.
yours to tell not because you can't. I mean, you can write anything you want to write. Nobody's going to stop you. But even in publishing, there are stories that you tell that are not yours to tell, but then prevents the people who own those stories, who don't have access, the same privileges that you have to have their stories told. And then your story becomes the dominant narrative that doesn't do justice to their stories. So I do think that there is something to be said for sort of being aware of power dynamics when we're telling certain stories.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, so my novel is about Burma, and my mother's people in Burma were long oppressed. In fact, they had their hands cut off if they were found with writing implements, such that they lost their written histories, their spiritual texts, their alphabet. And part of me was like, well, I'm only half. So is it my right to write their story? Is it my place? But I think that I like what you said about being aware of the power dynamics as one dares to say, perhaps it can be my place also. No one else had written that narrative, but
also being aware of your privilege to access certain places that, you know, certain people who, you know, can't access that. I think that we should always be aware of that. It's not, like you said, it's very it's nuanced, it's very complicated. It's not just about having the freedom to write what you want to write, because nobody's ever going to stop you from writing what you want to write, right? You have total freedom, but it's being aware of that, and sometimes taking a step back and realizing that, you know, this is maybe not my place to tell this story.
I wish I believed that we had total freedom.
Yeah.
No, I know.
Yeah.
My book's about to come out in Burma, and I'm all too aware that it could be edited and censored down, and I just, I don't know. Sorry, we're getting into this.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Chika mentioned something as there not being too much kindness in literature. And I think, you know, one of the greatest criticisms of the Victorian novels, right, is the romanticism, where the good guy is absolutely good and the bad guy is absolutely evil. And there's nothing like that. You know, when you look at reality, even the most pious person has some failings. And if this is not reflected in literature, then it's not genuine. So yes, there's something as too much kindness, and there's something as too much evil, right?
Also, Chika, I'd sort of like to get into this with you a little bit, because any story you tell, particularly now in this world, you're going to Belgium, right? So you have a character who must be Belgian, or Nigerian. Okay, but you must have some Belgians in the book, right? I mean, I have people in my book who aren't like me, but the world I live in has lots of people who aren't like.
Yeah, but I it's not as simple as that.
I know.
It's not as simple as just having characters who are not like you. It's about the stories that you choose to tell. And let me phrase this another way. I read a book recently, relatively recently, by an American author, which is set in Nigeria, which has a Nigerian character, central character. But this author, did not even take the time to research the character's name. So the character's name and where the character comes from do not tally, right? And where the character lives and the just physical structures of the place do not tally. And that to me shows a certain disrespect towards the character and towards the people, right? He did not bother to do any research beyond maybe just Googling on Google, And of course, a non-Nigerian writer reading that book doesn't see any of those things. And of course it doesn't matter because that story got published. It did really, really well. But I think that personally as a writer, you should have a certain level of integrity, And this whole thing of power dynamics, sorry to just sort of keep going on about it, you also see it in the language that we use, Yes. Who's an expatriate and who's an immigrant, I'll always be an immigrant outside of Africa, no matter where I go to, no matter what I do, So you hear about immigrant doctors in the US, and of course they mean brown and black doctors. My husband is a white immigrant, but he's an expatriate, And then you move to you go to Africa, and no matter what the white person is doing there, they're always expatriates, and they're never asked to integrate, and so you move to. We're constantly being told, well, if you come to our country, especially in this era of Trump, you should integrate, you should learn the language. And then you go to Africa, the biggest ghettos, they are built by Westerners who don't know the name of anybody beyond their gate men. It's just simply, so we always sort of have to be aware, that there is power struggle and power dynamics going on.
Yeah. I just want to kind of emphasize what Chika is saying. I'm familiar with the book she's mentioning, or she's talking about, without mentioning the name. When I wrote my book, because it's a very sensitive issue, when it was launched in Lagos, which is in the south of Nigeria, there were genuine fears that there would be a fatwa against me for writing something as provocative as that. And I said, well, I never thought of it in that sense, and I never felt that fear, because I felt I had been faithful to the people I wrote about. And it's not because I wanted to raise important issues, but I also was very conscious of the sensitivity of those people. And I think a lot of novelists take these things for granted. They just write and don't really take into consideration that there's a way to write about people and make them see things or talk about things without necessarily provoking them or offending their sensibilities. And that is something really important that we should consider.
Sorry, just something very short. I was going to add to the whole, just because you mentioned this writer again, the American writer. So for Africans writing in Africa, mostly the center of publishing is still, New York and London, right? And the gatekeepers to that are still people who do not look like us. And so we would not get away with writing white characters because of those gatekeepers, but then Western writers get away with writing, but like this guy got away with writing about a Nigeria that he knows absolutely nothing about,
Do you think that's changing?
I don't know. Only if surely he must have had some advantage to start with, because a lot of us cannot get away with
No.
with writing about something.
Yeah, no,
other than
the only advantage he had to start with was privilege, right?
Yeah.
So that was the only advantage he had to start with, and that was all he needed. It was a privilege.
what kind of privilege? What privilege did he have?
White male writer writing in the West and being published in America, and having access to those the centers of publishing.
I should mention one thing that I was going to bring up, which you people have set up for me, which is something to do with your novel, Abubakar. One of the very good things about it is that I read it not as something that was published in Africa, but it was published in India, out of New Delhi, the city where I live, by an Indian publisher. And speaking to Chika's point, I think one of the ways novels are, of course, we benignly assume that novels are read, different novels by different writers are read by readers everywhere. But there is a politics to publishing, and one of the very good things, and perhaps one of the necessary things about the future of the novel in the 21st century, is that there will be new alliances between continents outside of always having to go through Europe or America. Right. And perhaps we are living in the age where these things are becoming possible, partly because of advances in publishing. And in a way, it's very, very nice for me, someone like me, to read someone like you without anybody else getting in the way.
Thank you, that's good to know. I actually think that, we've always had this problem also on the continent in Africa that
yes.
For a Nigerian writer to read a Ghanaian novelist, we are practically next door to each other. It has to go through London and then come back.
Yeah, we forget these things as well,
yeah.
Yes.
So there are no channels of getting books across borders, and we had this conference in 2014, and we thought that this process is ridiculous, right? So we kind of made arrangements and found ways of getting books across. Now you have Ghanaian books in Nigerian bookstores, you have Nigerian books in Ghanaian bookstores, without the intervention of London or New York. And it's also really great that something like this is beginning to happen. And now my book has been published here in India.
Yes.
And I'm aware that there's an Indian writer who is in the process of being published in Nigeria. And, if we are able to kind of cut out those intermediaries who happen to be the hegemony and, dictates what a good story should be based on their own taste, I think it will go a long way in kind of improving.
Not that we are suggesting there's something devious about the world as it is set up today, just that there are other ways also.
There are other ways of doing things.
Well, it seems that there's not enough time for me to ask the most important, the most foundational, the biggest question I'd planned to ask today. And instead, but shall I quickly?
Yes.
I'm going to ask it to you, Charmaine. Some of us were speaking about the experiences of writing books that in which our families either found themselves or began to feel as if there was a part of us that was being expressed in these books that they were not comfortable with. But is this, should we give them the benefit of doubt? Because there's something often readers also don't understand, that there's a difference in the novel between the writer, whose face appears on the back cover, and the narrator, who's also an imagined person, as characters are. And how does one sort of bring out the subtlety that novels have narrators as well? They are the people doing the seeing, not always the writer. That's
a big question. I mean, absolutely. One of the things I always try to teach my students is the narrator is not the author, has a distinct presence in the novel. Are you also asking, though, a little bit about how we get past our allegiances to our family members?
No. I was in the realm of technique. I was saying this is something. It's not something merely academic. It's a useful thing to know for reading novels.
I think the more writers, students of writing, but also readers are sensitive to the nuances. Really, what we're talking about is point of view.
Yes.
What we learn when we're kids is there's first person and third person, but really. Both of those forms, particularly third, are so robust and take so many faces. So sometimes the narrator can be a very externalized vocalization, looking down at the characters from the outside. Sometimes there can be what's called figural vocalizations. That's much more common these days, where there's the narrator is really almost implanted inside the psyche of the central characters or the protagonists one at a time, and that becomes the filter through which we, the readers, experience, along with the characters, the world.
But there's where your political correctness gets tricky, right? Because you may have a character the narrator's zooming down into, but whose opinions the narrator would never hold.
And that's what made things interesting, right?
Yeah.
Instead of didactic.
Yeah, but that's why it's a novel, it's fiction. I think, sorry, just one more word on political correctness. I think that my problem with saying that there is too much political correctness or that people take offense very easily is that you're calibrating the level of somebody's offense. You don't tell me not to take offense. You don't tell me whether I should or should not be offended. And that is so when I hear, people get easily offended, what I hear is that you're telling me, do not get offended when I do this. But it's not your place to tell me that.
The flip side of that is political correctness is a measure or barometer by which one should be offended. That might be the flip side of it. It's sort of like saying, here's a manual and what should be offensive. I agree with you that it's so useful, but it's sort of,
I don't
it's
know.
the flip side.
No, I don't think I agree with that.
This is actually, I think this is a debate that we should have added on another hour afterwards. Sometimes we should have panels where there's an hour left behind for things that come up during the panel, which then form another discussion.
Back room and fight it out.
But I think we have room for one or two questions, and there's so many. You there in the blue shirt. And if you keep your questions short, then we could have 4 or 5. And if you have them for someone in particular, do say so.
Mr. Ibrahim mentioned novelists are dead people. It reminded me of a passage that I read in a film studies class, Death of an Author, by Roland Barthes. So what I could sense out of the few sessions that I attended in this festival is the sovereignty that the authors want to exercise over what they write. Also, I have a problem with the idea how they want to keep authorship and readership on the two extreme sides of the continuum. Why they want to keep themselves on the other side of the continuum and readers, why can these authorship and readership be intermingled or they do meet at some point of time?
I'm not sure I entirely understand that question, but I think there's a point of convergence between a writer and a reader, and that point of convergence is very delicate. But also there's a point where the lines tend to want to cross. And that is when readers want to make the assumption that the writer is somehow a protagonist of his novel. And I've had people ask me, people who argue with me that I am Hassan Reza, who is the character in my book, and this is a very notorious character, right? And I'm like, well, I don't look like him, I don't sound like him. And they say, oh, you have dark lips, just like him. And I'm like, what the hell is that? But basically, I think there are lines, and a reader has to be conscious of who the writer is and be conscious of the distance that there is between the writer and his work, and the writer has to be conscious of the sensibility of the readers. I think the readers are very important people, and I do have consideration for them when I do write.
You at the back, yes.
My question is to Charmaine, ma'am. I wish I had the privilege of being your student, but since I don't, what would be your advice to aspiring writers about how to structure a novel? Do you simultaneously work on the central theme and the central characters, or do you define the protagonist first and then carve out the world? I'm sorry.
Oh, this is a... That's good. I think that's enough.
If only I had a formula,
Yeah.
make things much easier. But I think that we talked a little bit about beginnings, and I think it's so often in the beginning of a novel, there is that beautiful crystallization of, we have a sense of the ending even. There's a way in which the major themes and inner conflicts are forefronted. We get a sense of the protagonist, or at least one of them, and really what their central affliction is. We get a dousing in the point of view, or a sense of the overall structure. I think it's a great sign that you're asking about structure, because for me, my experience has been, once I figure out the structure, it becomes a lot easier to approach. And my only advice parting advice that I would say is, I would argue, we were talking about point of view, I would argue that start with third person, because it's a much more flexible point of view that it can accommodate. It's not that there's anything wrong with first person. I think it's harder to pull off.
This is a good. Last question. You, ma'am. I'm so sorry we cannot take more.
I will be politically incorrect and with due apologies to the panelists. And I also am asking myself whether it is my position to ask this. So coming back to the two things before, this is for Linda and for Abubakar. With your shared history of pain and anger and shame, as both of you in your previous sessions have mentioned that you've come from a family that owned slaves, and Abu has talked about how the colonization has happened. My question is, when the two of you sit next to each other on a panel, sharing your craft, how does it percolate down to your personal issues? Do you reach out and embrace each other and say,
you could do it right now.
what do we do now in this fragmented world?
As you can see, we are good. Slavery was something that happened to our ancestors. I don't have any direct descendant, or I'm not a descendant from a family that was sold into slavery, so I can't say it's a personal story, but it's the story of our people as Africans generally. And it would be most unfair to hold somebody like Linda responsible for the sins of her ancestors or whoever they were. She didn't do it, she wasn't a party to it, and I'm sure she wouldn't agree with it if it's going to happen again. Would you, Linda?
No. No, my interest in slavery, and why would I want to write about it, as some people have asked me, what the hell, well, is really, I'm very interested not just in the experience of the slave, but in the experience of the slaver. What incredible distortion of soul must happen when you believe you can own another person. I mean, it's really quite a shocking and amazing thing. We can't even conceive of it now, right? But it wasn't so long ago. And I also, of course, wonder what our great-grandchildren will think about some of the things that we do, such as me eating meat. I suspect that my great-granddaughters will say, oh my God, but I know it's not an equivalent, but I'm just, you know, it's the souls of these human beings that you have to look into and think, you know, how distorted and damaged they must have been. I mean, I don't want to do that about Trump every morning. I don't want to say, oh, poor thing. But really, these people have serious consequences to their, you know, because of their actions.
We have till 12:30, so before the next event starts. So maybe you can take one last. Yeah, you've been very eager to ask something.
Sorry, just before the question, I just need to kind of balance this out. I think it's important to state that slavery would not have been possible without the active agency of Africans as well. You know, so just to be fair, and not to seem as if we are just bashing the whites and saying, no, it's all their fault. I mean, the Africans helped in propagating this thing. So.
Yes, very quickly.
This is an open question because I was not sure who to ask this to. Considering how subjective it is comparing two novels or judging a novel, what would you say is the definition of a classic novel? Like, what is a classic novel or a good novel?
Well, there's a book by that theme called What is a Classic by Italo Calvino, which I think has some very interesting answers. But does anybody else want to? This is a...
I think one of the definitions, but it wouldn't be mine necessarily, but that I've read, is that it's a novel that can't be improved upon. I don't really know if I would agree with that, but I think I mentioned this earlier. For me, usually, those classic novels, something about, they're more preoccupied with the immutable conditions of humanity than the relativist ones, with the recurring in our human story, rather than in necessarily the moment. So they're rendering the singular, they're rendering the individual case. But that's why they speak to us across time. But others?
Okay, we have to end there, but ladies and gentlemen, you had a good time, yes? This was a good session, I think. And for that, thank you to all four of them. There is a little signing tent just outside here.